And it's our sincere hope that you'll accept the invitation to share your images with us. Membership in the NYSA is not required. Today's co-hosts are Jim Hart, David Heiser, and E. James Smith, and I'll thank them in advance for their help and participation. Today's presenter, Bob Zeller, has authored several books with 3D content and has been an avid collector and Civil War history buff since he was quite young. He discovered a home stereo viewer when he was 13 and pursued that hobby to the benefit of us all. He's currently the president of the Center for Civil War Photography, and we're fortunate to have him with us today from his home in North Carolina. Then we'll drop a coin into the Anaglyph Jukebox, then it's off to the Civil War. The first one, that is.
Welcome to today's edition of the Anaglyph Jukebox. You never know what you'll find on the old jukebox. Let's press B31. Okay, we've got Sergio Aragon's 3D. Did you ever read Mad Magazine? I sure did. Did you ever check out the little drawings on the top, sides, and bottoms of the pages? That was a feature called Marginal Thinking by Sergio Aragonés, one of Spain's greatest exports. Aragonés has contributed dozens of humorous drawings to every issue of Mad Magazine since 1963, except once when the post office lost his contribution. He also does a 4 to 5 page feature in each issue where he does silent gags on a single topic. Sergio Aragonés is one of the world's most prolific cartoonists, one of the world's fastest cartoonists, and one of the most brilliant. In addition to his decades of contributions to Mad and other humor magazines, Aragonés created the humorous barbarian character Gru the Wanderer. As a creator-owned property, Gru has been published by a number of companies: Pacific Comics, Eclipse Comics, Epic, a Marvel imprint, Image Comics, and currently Dark Horse Comics. Al Jaffe of Mad's Fold-In fame said, "Sergio has, quite literally, drawn more cartoons on napkins in restaurants than most cartoonists draw in their entire careers." Writer Mark Evanier, who collaborated with Aragonés on Gru the Wanderer, estimates that Aragonés has written and drawn more than 12,000 gag cartoons for Mad Magazine alone. Aragonés also has a connection to another Anaglyph Jukebox favorite, Sheena, Queen of the Jungle. Growing up in Mexico, Aragonés' father worked on episodes of the TV series adaptation of Sheena. When a stuntman didn't show up one day in 1955, a teenage Sergio was fitted into a leopard skin costume and wig. He dove into water, did a little vine swinging, all far from a distant camera. Of course, the young boy looked nothing at all like the statuesque Irish Macawa who starred as Sheena. Aragonés arrived in New York City in 1962 with $20 US, a limited command of English, and a portfolio of cartoons. After knocking about a bit in odd jobs, he followed people's suggestion that he try and submit his work to Mad Magazine. After a confusing introduction by Antonio Projas, creator of the Spy vs. Spy strip, who was even less proficient in English than Aragonés, editor Al Feldstein and publisher Bill Gaines were impressed by his portfolio, and he made his first sale that day. Encouraged by editor Jerry DeFuccio to submit more material, he drew up a full article on motorcycles overnight and returned the following morning, where he made his second sale. Since then, Aragonés has won every award the field can offer: a Shazam Award, the Inkpot Award, a Harvey Award, the National Cartoon Society Comic Book and Humor Comic Book Awards, a Reuben Award, and an Eisner Award. In 2009, he was the subject of an exhibition, Mad About Sergio, at the Ojai Valley Museum in California. Aragon has also worked in animation, the Dick Clark blooper programs, and drawing live on air for NBC's Speak Up America program. I want to close this brief account with an anecdote by Aragon's frequent collaborator, Mark Evanier, that touches on his television work for NBC. Mark explains, "This was one of the most beautiful women in the world, and she wore this dress that was very revealing. So much so, the censors wouldn't let us put her on air in it without adding some material. So we're all talking to her, the writers and whoever, just in awe of this woman. And Sergio comes walking in looking like a homeless person carrying his portfolio. And Jane sees him and she shouts, 'Sergio!' And she runs over and starts kissing him passionately. They'd worked together before, it turned out. But Johnny Carson comes walking out into the hallway and he thinks Jane Kennedy is being sexually assaulted by a homeless person in the NBC hallways. So he comes over to make sure she was okay. She said it was fine, that she knew him. And I said, it's okay. He's a cartoonist. So Johnny gives that classic look and he says, 'I knew I should have taken up drawing.'"
Today's show is basically the top 10 Civil War photographs in 3D, except that I couldn't cut the list down to 10. The best I could do was 13. To squeeze a couple of more images in as much as any other reason, I've got a couple of preview slides. This is the first one. A lot of you are probably familiar with it. It's the Appleton and Company stereo store on Broadway in around 1860. And I show this in a lot of shows simply to show the extensiveness of marketing of stereoscopic views even before the Civil War. The wet plate negative had come along in the 1850s and was by 1859, 1860 was being used extensively by American photographers. And simultaneously, there was a craze throughout America for carte de visites, which were photographic keepsakes, and stereo views, which were photographic viewing experiences. I like to call them the video of Civil War America. And back when it used to exist, I would describe this store as the blockbuster video of Civil War America. As Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote, your mind feels its way into the depths of the photograph. And there are not too many great stereo views of the marketing of stereoscopic photos, but this is one of them, a hand-tinted view. Now, this is one of the great 3D photos is for 3D effects, but I wanted to kind of use it to explain my methodology behind this. And to make my list, the photograph had to have both great 3D and great historical value. And this photo has terrific 3D, as I've used it in lots and lots of shows, most shows, but it shows Fort Sumter in 1865 in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. But it's one of many photos of Fort Sumter taken actually throughout the war. And so the historical quality comes up a little bit short, and thus this does not make my top list. Now, if you go to the next one. Similarly, this is a tremendously historic stereoscopic photograph. It actually surfaced on eBay around the year 2000. I think it sold for about $4,000. It's been acquired since then by the Nelson Atkins Museum, and it shows Abraham Lincoln delivering his second inaugural speech with malice towards none, the famous, only 800 words, and he wasn't up at this podium for very long. And Alexander Gardner, the photographer, had to move pretty quick to be able to take this photo. But the 3D effect keeps it off my top list, or should I say somewhat lack of. It's interesting, if you zoom in on it, it gets better, but great historical value, but just comes up a little short on the 3D side. Now, going on to the list, number 13. Number 13 shows Atlanta, Georgia, by George Barnard. This is off the original glass plate negatives. Contrary to myth, most of the important glass plate negatives from the core collections of Civil War documentary photos done by Alexander Gardner and also by the E&H.T. Anthony Company, more than 2,000 negatives. Most of them still exist. And this is meticulously restored by our imaging director at the Center for Civil War Photography, John Richter, showing Atlanta, Whitehall Street, early November 1864, just before Sherman departs Atlanta and burns the city basically to the ground. Lots of incredible detail in here, including refugees on top of those boxcars, the so-called last train out of Atlanta. On the right-hand side of the boxcars, so you can actually see fire equipment that Sherman is confiscating from the city and taking away. He's going to burn the city, not try to prevent it. But one of the great details, and something that just came to light a few years ago, we noticed these soldiers down in the middle of the street or by the street gathered around some sort of a device. And we spent a good part of one day, me and some of the others in the center, exploring what this might be, a piece of surveying equipment perhaps, or something. And George Whiteley from Atlanta, turns out, described it properly. It's a 4-person commercial stereoscopic viewer by S.D. Goodale and Company. It actually shows up in another carte de visite during the war, but very, very few photographs from the Civil War era show stereoscopic, anything stereoscopic. I mean, as many years before I realized that probably 70% of the documentary photos are stereo. But here it is in the middle of Atlanta, tremendously historic moment just before Sherman burns the city and begins his march to the sea. And these soldiers are looking at stereo photos down on the street. Number 12, this wonderful portrait from Cold Harbor, Virginia in June 1864, once again off the original glass plate negatives, meticulously restored, and we see Matthew Brady sitting on the left and Ambrose Burnside, the Union general famous for Burnside's bridge at Antietam, sitting there on the right, reading a Washington newspaper. And you can identify it when you darken this view and zoom in on the great detail within these huge, relatively speaking, huge negatives, that it's a copy of the Washington Daily Intelligencer. This was after the bloody battle at Cold Harbor. Matthew Brady at this point in time was the official photographer of the headquarters unit of the Army of the Potomac, and thus had the access that he needed. And he shows up in other photos taken around this same time. Also photographed General Grant at his tent headquarters. But this has just wonderful 3D, and we showed it as a test shot at the National Archives in a lecture I did to make sure that everybody could see it in 3D, which of course we knew they could. But when we showed it, everybody broke out in applause, and it's never happened before in any show I've ever done. But this is a really, really great 3D photo from the war. And number 11, on the deck of the USS Monitor in Hampton Roads, Virginia, down in the Norfolk area in July 1862, not too long after its battle with the CSS Virginia, the Battle of the Ironclads. We see the crew of the Monitor on the deck. It's just got terrific 3D, once again, off the original glass plate negatives. Stereoscopic pair still exists. And what's cool about this photo to me, though, is that it's almost 2 photos in one, because we're going to show you a detail that almost turns it into a different image. We see the bulk of the crew here in the background by the turret of the Monitor. And these were the 3 photos that I couldn't cut. So this is 13, 12, and 11, and we'll now start the top 10 Civil War photos in 3D. You're on the Gettysburg battlefield, specifically up on top of Little Round Top. It's July 1863, about 2 weeks after the battle. Matthew Brady took this photograph, he and his operators, once again, off the original glass plate negative, just incredible detail, and beautiful 3D. And Brady, unlike Gardner, who preceded him, Brady did not get photographs of the dead. They had been buried by the time he got there. Gardner took more than 40. But Brady had better atmospheric conditions than Gardner. And as we zoom in on this shot, we notice that the great area of where Pickett's charge occurred on the left-hand side of the picture, basically that's Seminary Ridge, and the left of Ziegler's Grove, that grove of trees there in the distance, is the whole line where the Union defensive line was on Cemetery Ridge, excuse me, for Pickett's charge. The copse of trees is out there, and once again, the historic value of this photo combined with the incredible 3D clarity, especially when restored on the original glass plate negatives, is just stunning. All right, number 9, yet another photo off the original glass plate negative. This was taken by George Barnard, working for Matthew Brady in March 1862 at the battlefield of Bull Run. And you're on Henry House Hill, which was sort of the focal point, the center point of the later part of the action in the Battle of Bull Run. And you see the ruins of the house of Mrs. Judith Henry, why this was called Henry House Hill. Mrs. Henry became a casualty of the battle. She was killed during the battle, one of the few civilian casualties, during the war. Obviously, the soldier has been placed there, and this is a multi-second exposure, so everybody's been told to stay still. The soldier's head is slightly moving, but just he was placed there for better 3D effect, and the result was a terrific 3D photo from aftermath of the First Battle of Bull Run. Okay, this is number 8. And this is the return of the 69th Regiment to New York City. This was a 90-day regiment signed up at the beginning of the war, marched out to Bull Run, lost more than 40 men, and at the end of their 90 days in August 1861, came home to New York City to a triumphant parade up Broadway. It's a hot day. Some people have umbrellas out, but they're just crowding in. Most of the parades, you'll see them making room on the street, but here they're just crowding in. And this is an example, and certainly one that I wanted to include, at least one in the top list. But this is an example of an Anthony's instantaneous view, a stop action view that they advertised as being the shutter speed of a 40th of a second. They were extremely proud of these views. If you're an antique stereo photo collector, you know that they're very common in today's market. That's how popular they were. And Anthony had proclaimed, "No visitor should leave New York without some of them to astonish friends at home." And of course, one of their most favorite and popular ones was Broadway on a rainy day. But they also took several real good hardcore news photographs. And the return of the 69th was a big deal in the summer of 1861 in New York. There's a famous painting of it as well, and just a spectacular stereo photograph. Jeff Krause owns one taken in May of 1861 from this same window, showing a giant recruiting banner hanging over Broadway, also an instantaneous view. Just a great 3D candid photo. Number 7, this is an example of one of the very first photographs of the Civil War. The first photos of the Civil War were shot by Confederate photographers, specifically Alma Pilo for the Jesse Bowles Gallery, taking 2D photographs, larger format. and Osborne and Durbeck, Charleston photographers who specialized in stereo views. And they took more than 40 stereo views of Fort Sumter, Fort Moultrie, and other sites in the aftermath of the bombardment, just 2 days after the April 1861 bombardment. It's really tough to pick which one to use in this show because there's 3 or 4 that just have incredible 3D. And this is one of them. I decided to use it because it is in Fort Sumter on the parapet, and you see Confederate ordnance officers examining a ruined cannon. The cannon was disabled by a misfire fired by the Union troops, not by rebel shells coming into the Fort Sumter. But only the original prints of these photographs exist. They're extremely rare. The Library of Congress has a wonderful collection of them, courtesy of one of our members, Robin Stanford, who was a collector of stereo views of Texas and also the Civil War. Just a very, very aggressive collector for many, many, many years, and assembled more than 40 of these Osborne and Durbeck original prints. Number 6 is an example, a wonderful example of portrait photography in the field. This is Alfred R. Woad, a sketch artist for Harper's Weekly. He often accompanied the photographers. Woad was good friends with Gardner. He also had in his personal collection many half stereo unmounted albumin prints, which indicates that he was the artist, or was certainly affiliated with the process of turning some of these photographs into woodcut engravings so they could be published in Harper's Weekly. This is a Gardner photograph taken just a few days after the Battle of Gettysburg, and you see Woad sitting on a rock in Devil's Den. This is once again off the original stereoscopic glass plate negative preserved at the Library of Congress. These images can be downloaded at high resolution for free, and using the great Stereo Photo Maker program that you can also get for free, you can create your own anaglyphs from almost 2,000 Civil War stereoscopic negatives. The problem or challenge, of course, is that you have to restore them for the best 3D vision, because there's little specks and marks on either side that don't line up. So you got to restore them carefully. Okay, number 5, getting into the top 5 Civil War 3D photos. We have a picture of recently freed African-American slaves in Richmond. After the fall of Richmond, this photograph was taken by Alexander Gardner in June 1865, with the ruins of the Gallego Mills towering above this family portrait. Just wonderful 3D and an incredibly strong and representative picture. Certainly had to be among, in my estimation, the top 5 photos in 3D from the Civil War. Number 4, I like to call the first great American War photograph. This is June 27th or 28th, 1862. It's after the Battle of Gaines' Mill, and you're at Savage Station, Virginia, at a makeshift field hospital of the 16th New York Infantry. The 16th New York was famous for their straw hats. That's why you see a lot of soldiers wearing straw hats. But this is an incredibly candid photo of what was actually happening out there on the battlefield. And one of the first photos to really show that, and I think the first really great American War photo. You can see a soldier there in the foreground holding what appears to be a compress to his head, while a regimental surgeon appears to be working on a leg wound. It's the black and white photo. Once again, this is off the original glass plate negatives. But if the regular image wasn't enough, Gardner and his team Actually, this was taken under Matthew Brady's employ, but the negative stayed with Gardner. Either way, they would hand color it. And there is actually a hand colored original print at the Library of Congress of this view, originally from the collection of the Alan Pinkerton. And there's just blood all through it. And I wanted to add it to the show, but it doesn't show up in the anaglyph. It just looks muddy because of the added color. But there was kind of a progression towards really capturing what was happening out there on the battlefield. This was one of the first instances, followed in August. This was June 1862, followed in August by pictures of dead horses after the Battle of Cedar Mountain, and then Antietam coming up. Now this is particularly compelling because on June 29th, the Confederates launched a massive counterattack at Savage Station, and most of these men were captured. Number 3 is one of 20 photographs of the Antietam dead, taken by Alexander Gardner in the aftermath of that battle of September 17th, 1862, the bloodiest day in American history. You're looking at Confederate artillerymen, dead Confederates gathered around their caisson from the artillery position that was just hammered by Union Parrott guns on the other side of Antietam Creek that had much longer range and were very effective. In the background is the Dunkard Church. This church was the worshiping place for a sect of pacifists who eschewed such vanities as steeples on their churches. It's right in the middle of the battlefield. You can see it damaged. The congregation quickly repaired that damage, and when it was photographed by Alexander Gardner's brother James in June 1863, before Gettysburg, it had been fully repaired. But this is one of 20 photographs that Gardner took of the dead at Antietam, every single one of them shot in 3D. There's 2 or 3 others that you could choose and easily place in the top list. But I think this is probably the most famous and certainly one of the most popular back then at the time, because it's one of the more, certainly Alexander Gardner's stereo views are pretty rare, but this one shows up more than just about any other. So I think that's an indication of how popular the image was back then. This showed just one more thing on it. These photographs of Antietam were shown at Brady's New York Gallery about a month after the battle, in mid-October 1862, and the New York Times reported, "If Brady has not brought bodies and laid them in our dooryards and along our streets, he has done something very like it." And there were lines of people, the Times reported, waiting to get in to see these photographs. The interesting thing is, and the article doesn't mention seeing them in 3D, and they apparently were displayed as Brady album gallery cards, the full 4x5-inch half stereo prints of the photo. And this is actually the full frame. The stereo cards were cut down to 3x3 inches, but this is the full frame photo of the Dunkard Church scene. So we don't know whether they were actually put on display in 3D, but I think they have to have been available that way. They just weren't mentioned because Brady sold 3D cards as well as full 4x5-inch full frame album gallery cards. And there were carte de visites as well sold. Okay, the next one. Number 2. Another photograph from Antietam. I don't see how you cannot include Abraham Lincoln in any list of the best 3D photos of the Civil War without including one of his photos taken in 3D at Antietam. You've got 2 choices here, the famous picture of Lincoln and McClellan in the tent, or this one, which I decided won out over the other one, because it really shows how tall Lincoln was and how much taller he looked with his top hat on. George McClellan, the Union Army of the Potomac commander, is standing 2 people to the right of Lincoln, short, kind of there next to one of those little benches, considerably shorter. Lincoln went to the battlefield. This was 2.5 weeks after the battle, to try to kind of prod McClellan into doing something like crossing the Potomac and going after Robert E. Lee. Anyway, the 3D effect of this picture is fantastic, and the historic value unquestionable. And it almost became my #1 3D photo of all time of the Civil War, but it's not, because the next one is. Oh yeah, let's zoom in on it and just hold it there for a second to take a look at Lincoln and some of the Union generals during that historic visit. It wasn't taken in 3D, but I have a photo. You can see it also at the Met Museum of McClellan's staff having a cocktail party on the day of Lincoln's visit. They're all drinking. It's a great photo. Too bad it's not 3D. All right, this is it. The #1 Civil War photo in 3D, in my estimation. This is, as I've often described it, what I consider to be the first combat action photograph in history. The first photograph of the enemy in action by a photographer who was himself under fire at the time he was taking photographs. This photo was taken by George S. Cook inside Fort Sumter on September 8th, 1863. He's crawled up to the parapet. He's put his camera on a piece of a broken gun carriage, and he's photographed the enemy fleet, the USS New Ironsides, largest battleship on the face of the earth, in the lead, with battle smoke pouring off of it as it's firing at Fort Moultrie, trailed by 2 Monitor-class warships. What happened on this day is that Cook had been commissioned by the Confederate government to come out to the fort and take a picture of what it looked like after this incessant daily bombardment by the Union forces on Morris Island throughout 1863. And basically had been reduced to rubble, which ironically made it stronger. The Confederates held Fort Sumter throughout the war. Anyway, they asked George Cook to come out with his camera and take pictures, document the damage to the fort. And the day he was there, the USS Weehawken, an ironclad, got stuck on a sandbar near Fort Sumter. And Fort Sumter's guns had gone silent 2 or 3 weeks earlier, but across the harbor there to the left, or across, Charleston Harbor, Fort Moultrie was still quite active, and it started firing at the stranded Weehawken, and that brought the entire Union Navy out to fight and defend it. And Cook managed to get this stereo photo and about 8 or 9 others that day inside the fort. But this one has one of the reasons why it is #1 on my list, other than being the first combat photo, is that it's a photo that's just given me gift after gift and throughout my career in kind of building the 3D history of the Civil War. My first book, The Civil War in Depth, on the weekend of the deadline before the manuscript was due, I discovered that it was a stereo photo. I was going to put it in the book as a 2D photo anyway, but I discovered that I was showing my wife one reproduction of it in Miller's Photographic History and another in the Image of War series. I said, look how much better this one is than this one. And she happened to say, is it the same photo? I started looking at it, and that piece of gun carriage came in at a different angle on the 2 photos. So rushed down to the hardware store, made photocopies, put them together, checked them out with a lorgnette viewer. The thing blew out in 3D at me, and I was just amazed. It sent shivers up my spine. So it was like this gift out of nowhere, another 3D photo, the first combat photo for my first book. And I then was able to find an original print from 1880, terrible condition, not really shows much, but nonetheless, I was able to find out that it was published actually by Cook's son in 1880. And that was in my second book. And then a third book, my History of Civil War Photography, while doing research at the Valentine Museum, which is the home of the Cook collection, I discovered that the original negative still existed. I got it scanned at 600 DPI, high resolution, if you zoom in on the scene here, the detail is just amazing, and it doesn't show up in any prints from the war. Can we cut to the, or go to the zoomed in version? There we go. It's got a different tonal quality. That just happened to be the way it was done. But you can see here on the right, there's the detail is such that you can see the American flag hanging from the trailing monitor. All those little black dots between you and the monitor are harbor obstructions put in by the Confederates. So there was a narrow channel that they had to sail up. And the negative, the original negative, also confirmed that that battle smoke was real, that it wasn't added, it wasn't a retouch job. For these reasons, for the great 3D and the historic value, this is my #1 Civil War photo in 3D. And if anybody has any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them.
Well, first off, everyone, that was fantastic. Thank you, Bob. I think we need a hand of applause. There we go.